Welcome to Bethesda Naval Hospital. Room 1634, May 22nd, 1949, 1:45 a.m. James Forrestal, America's very first Secretary of Defense, lies anxiously awake. He writes scattered thoughts in his journal as an abrupt knock is heard at the door. His heart sinks into his stomach. He puts on his robe, ties it up, and walks on over and opens the door. Just 5 minutes later, James Forrestal is dead. They called it a suicide, but rooms don't get trashed over suicides. People closest to him reported that James Forrestal believed he was being followed, which investigators blamed on his poor mental state, and the guard posted up at his room every night suspiciously on leave the night of May 21st. The more you look into it, the more things don't add up about the mysterious death of James Forrestal. There are simply way too many inconsistencies, many of which we'll cover today, so be sure to stick around till the end. But even after all these years, the questions remain: who murdered James Forrestal, and why?
James Forrestal, Center, newly appointed Secretary of the U.S. Navy, confers with his assistants. Forrestal, as Undersecretary, played a major role in creating the largest Navy in the world. Now he is given its leadership.
Before he was the Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal was an accomplished everyman. Studying at both Dartmouth and Princeton, Forrestal was voted most likely to succeed by his peers. And, well, they were right. James went on to work on Wall Street in various positions up until World War I, where he would enlist in the Navy as an aviator, eventually reaching the rank of lieutenant. And after the war, James returned to Wall Street, where he would work his way up to partner and ultimately the president of his firm, William A. Reed and Company. Of course, as the story goes, Forrestal found his career in politics, joining Roosevelt's administration in 1940 as an assistant before quickly being appointed to Undersecretary of the Navy in the very same year. And in 1944, James would get another promotion when he'd become Secretary of the Navy, guiding them through the final stages of the war and the demobilization that followed. And in 1947, Forrestal was appointed as the first Secretary of Defense by President Truman, overseeing the transition of the Departments of War and Navy into what we know as the Department of Defense. In the post-war era, James Forrestal established his legacy by shaping the government as we know it. To put it plainly, he built the machine, the CIA, the Pentagon, the rules of secrecy. He was the architect of it all. So how could someone so important be cast out so abruptly? Well, he saw what they were really building. July 8th, 1947. Something crashes in the Roswell desert in the night. And Forrestal? He demands answers. He's one of the first to see the bodies, the first to hold the wreckage, and the first to realize that none of this is ours. But you won't see this in any history book. No official documents. Any and all involvement of Forrestal being there has been stripped from the record. And yet, witness testimonies state he was there, which would make sense. He was the Secretary of Defense. Anything foreign landing on our soil would have been his deal. How else are you supposed to know what you're up against if you don't see it with your very own eyes? James brings his findings to President Truman, who on September 24, 1947, signed a classified executive order to create a top-secret research and development division called Majestic 12, run by none other than James Forrestal. The goal was simple: to investigate and retrieve alien spacecraft and reverse engineer the technology. Anything regarding UFOs would have to go through him. But sadly, Forrestal wouldn't make it too far in this process, because something in New Mexico had changed him. And we don't know what it was. Was it the remains of life forms from another world, their alleged technology far beyond our own, or the realization that mankind was far from the dominant life form in the universe? making humanity and its pursuits futile and useless. Whatever it was, it caused Forrestal to become a shell of the man he once was. A man driven by purpose and secrecy suddenly found himself eager to open up, to confide in others. James pleaded with the president to inform the public about aliens and UFOs, which was, unsurprisingly, the final nail in his coffin. President Truman ordered Forrestal to resign as Secretary of Defense and be admitted into a mental hospital for its dissidents. It is here that James' story comes to a tragic end, but this is where the questions truly begin. There's a lot that doesn't add up about James Forrestal's death. To start, his room was under 24-hour supervision by a guard. The guard that was normally at this post, who chose to remain anonymous, actually had a really good relationship with Forrestal. James had even offered the young man a job as his secretary once he was out of the hospital. But on this particular night, and only this particular night, James's favorite guard was on unofficial leave. Why? Well, the questions don't end there. Secondly, James was allegedly writing excerpt from Sophocles' play Ajax before his death. The official report states that he stopped mid-word to answer the door before his night turned for the worse. But handwriting experts believe this to be a forgery, stating that Forrestal's letters were long and thin, whereas the words found in his book were more rounded. And since the dispute of the writing's authenticity, this evidence was stowed away, never to be seen again, which is convenient to say the least. James was known as a prolific writer from his newspaper days in college, so it's logical to assume that he would leave a suicide note with his own words for his loved ones. Instead, the poem is considered his suicide note. To add even more to the mystery, Nurse Dorothy Turner was stationed on the 7th floor when she heard the bone-chilling scream of a man falling down the side of the building, followed by a large smack. She immediately ran upstairs to James' room to find it in disarray, with the bed sheets torn off, along with broken glass by the bed, and a dry razor blade on the ground. Later on, when the crime scene photos of the room were released, Turner noticed some changes, the biggest one being that the room appeared to have been cleaned up since the incident, with no broken glass of any kind, along with the bed being made up. Another thing she noticed is that the pictures were taken during the daytime, a considerable amount of time after the incident took place. Just enough time to conceal all the evidence, perhaps. But even so, Turner would end up backtracking on a lot of her claims about the room, and was eventually transferred to a naval hospital in Guam. Unsurprisingly, the crime scene photo of the room received the same treatment as the poem, and was hidden away from the public eye. Tell me, why would a case for an apparent suicide go through all this trouble to hide the evidence? But the most important thing to note, at least for me, is that James was on the mend before his death. Henry Forrestal, James's brother, along with a priest by the name of Father Sheehy, reported James being in good health up until his death. He was clean-shaven, well-dressed, and had even gained back healthy weight that he had previously lost. But suspiciously, the Naval Hospital disallowed visitors for the final week of James's life. Even more suspicious is that Forrestal's primary doctor flies out to a medical conference that very same week. At the time of his death, James is completely isolated and surrounded by personnel that he is unfamiliar with. Henry Forrestal calls the hospital and demands his brother be released to him on May 22nd. He books train tickets for both he and his brother, along with a hotel room. Sadly, the day Henry was supposed to bring his brother home is also the day his brother died. Which leads us to the suspicious death itself. The official investigation concluded that James Forrestal tied one end of his rope cord around his neck and the other around his room's radiator before jumping out the window and hanging himself. Which, to me, seems like an overly complicated way to hang oneself, James would end up falling out the window, plummeting to his death. But which is it? Did he try to hang himself, or did he want to jump? In fact, if he wanted to hang himself within the room, there was reportedly a pipe on the ceiling in his kitchen that would have made more sense to use. All of these details just don't make sense, so much so that they can't be ignored. These inconsistencies lead to one conclusion, that James Forrestal was indeed murdered that night. But the questions remain: who did it, and why? At the time of his death, James Forrestal had a long list of enemies. James's brother Henry believed he was murdered by either communists or Israeli sympathizers, which are both plausible. When Forrestal was in power, he ran his own communist witch hunt, along with openly showing his disdain for America's reliance on Israel, claiming that alienating other Arab nations could hurt the nation's war efforts. That being said, some things don't add up about this. Like the fact that Forrestal was murdered when he was no longer in control, or even respected. In the grand scheme of things, James Forrestal was defeated, cast out, with his word no longer carrying any weight. What benefit or advantage do the communists or Israelis gain with his death? Interestingly enough, Forrestal didn't have only foreign enemies but also domestic. James had gained unwanted animosity from both the Army and the Air Force during his time as Secretary of the Navy. For all these divisions of the military are known to have intense rivalries up the chain of command. Not to mention that the Navy themselves had issues with Forrestal, who created a plethora of headaches and issues for the Navy once he became the Secretary of Defense. Even so, I can't imagine petty rivalries as a reason to murder someone, which leads to the true reason James Forrestal was murdered. He simply knew too much. He had seen too much. So he had to be silenced. But here's the kicker of it all. The documents regarding Majestic 12 were considered bogus by the FBI. They didn't even black anything out. They just wrote that all the information in the document was fake, which I find suspicious. If MJ-12 never existed, then why go through all the trouble to murder Forrestal? Something I also find interesting is that MJ-12 was allegedly a secret research division under the umbrella of the Navy and the President. And after Forrestal's death, the Air Force launched its own official research division into UFOs called Project Blue Book. Perhaps you've heard of it. If anything, this reinforces the idea that not only did MJ-12 exist for a brief time, but Forrestal was indeed murdered because of it. Perhaps military rivalries are more intense than I thought. J. Edgar Hoover, founder of the FBI, personally shut the case on Forrestal's death. The very man who invented blackmail quickly closes the case as a suicide. It's about time we ask ourselves why. As to who was behind the murder, sadly, we'll never know. But let's just look at history. The hundreds, thousands of voices silenced in the name of secrecy. And the list keeps on growing. In a time of apparent disclosure, all we see is false evidence or no evidence at all. Remember, you see only what they want you to see. And if you ever happen to see or hear something you shouldn't, I'd be very careful if I were you, because for all those that think they'll end up like this, they usually end up like this. Thanks for watching, and good night.